Okay, let's talk action potential. Action potential normally speaks to the state of voltage distribution across the membranes when the nerve cells or the neurons receive a signal. Right, so this is usually achieved when a signal is traveling, right? Or yeah, when a signal is generated or traveling. All right, looks a bit weird. Traveling. All right. So usually when it's generated or traveling, that's when we have an action potential, right? So generally it just means that the action potential, the state it is a neuron is in, right, when the neuron is active, right? So when it is active, right? That's simply what it generally refers to. Now we've got to talk about some stuff, right? Some key terms that I would like you to know before we get into everything, right? When we're talking about action potential, our units would be in millivolts, right? So our units would be millivolts, right? And there are some other terms I would like to talk about, right? Such as the sub-threshold, the threshold, right, and the supra threshold. Now the sub threshold, right, so this means that there's a stimuli, right, that is being interpreted, right? So the stimuli, right, cannot cause action potential. So we're saying that stimuli cannot cause action potential. With the threshold, right, the stimuli can cause an action potential, right? With the super threshold now, right, we're seeing now that an action potential is produced, an AP is produced, right, at a high intensity. So we're seeing here that subthreshold may be, let's say, somebody touching your skin or something touching your skin, right? Things that, like, for example, spiders. Some spiders or some bugs, when they touch your skin, you can't really feel them crawling, right? So they're moving, It is affecting some of the nerves, right? But it's at a sub-threshold, so you're not really feeling anything. There's not really any movement. There's not really any traveling of information, let's say that. It's at the sub-threshold, right? When somebody touches you now, you can feel it. So there is a threshold. So, right, thresholds really speak about, right, the amount of charge distribution required for a signal to be carried. So signals are being interpreted every single time, but it must reach that threshold in order for an action potential to move down the axon, right? Super threshold could be saying like somebody's touching you, but let's say that they're squeezing, right? Or they're applying too much pressure, right? So this starts creating pain, right? So it could speak about the fact that there's an action potential produced, but it's at a high intensity, right? Usually for pain receptors or any type of nerve damaging, right, can happen through super thresholds, right? Or when we reach super thresholds for a prolonged period. So it could be something like that. Now the threshold, right, generally, we're gonna be talking about threshold generally, okay, is around 50 millivolts to 55 millivolts. right? Negative 50 to negative 55 millivolts, right? So that is usually, right? So, and this really applies to the law of all or none, meaning that you can reach negative 40 millivolts, you can reach negative 30 millivolts, you could reach negative 20 millivolts. If you do not reach around negative 50 to negative 55, there will be no action potential. So you can think of it as all or nothing, right? So it's either if we're not going to reach the 55 millivolts or within the range, right, then there will be no action potential, right? So it has to reach that threshold there, right? So, right, so we have that there. Now let's start talking about how action potentials really work, right? Let's talk about how it really works happening, right? Let's first talk about hypopolarization, right? We're looking at the polarization, right? So remember now that we're looking at a membrane and we're saying that the membrane is gonna be a resting potential. Right? It's gonna be a resting potential, and this is because of the sodium potassium pumps we discussed in the resting potential video. Right? So we're looking at something like this. Now, let's say that, I don't know, you hit your elbow or something like that, right? Let's say that somebody touched you or you got pinched, right? Impulses will be sent, right? And this will be sent at specific frequencies through electrical currents, right? Now, what will happen is that there will be some type of polarization. Remember, there are polarization here already, right? This will be positive poles, right? And this will be a negative pole, right? There's going to be some amount of hypopolarization, right, to some extent. So this means that these signals that are carried, right, these electrical signals, right, really activate some amount of pumps on the membrane. So let's look at this. Let's look at the membrane, right? So we know the general sodium potassium pumps carrying sodium, 3 sodium out and 2 potassium in. So out, in, right? And we have our leaky membranes that carries potassium out, and that really creates a more negative charge here than a more positive charge out here. Now, when an impulse is being sensed, we tend to open other types of channels on the membranes, and these are our VGCs, right? Our voltage, right? Voltage gated channels. So voltage gated channels usually are activated, right? They're usually activated when there's a change in voltage, right? And these voltage gated ion channels, right, actually pull sodium ions back in, right? So when this happens, right, when there's a small amount of impulse, let's say that the impulse is around negative 30, right? So let's say it's around negative 30 millivolts, right? Negative 30 millivolts. Then there will be hypopolarization. This means that it's really small, right? We have not reached the threshold yet, right? So we're not there yet. So there's going to be a slight increase, right? And the voltage gauge ion channels are going to start to change, right? So this really happens there, right? But let's look at depolarization now. For depolarization, right, the electrical impulse is going to be much larger. So voltage gated ion channels, right, are all working. So notice that if there's going to be more positive energy, right, or more positive charge, right, on the inside, right, it's going to be increasing more positive charge on the inside and decreasing positive charge on the outside. So what we start to see here now is that a lot of sodium ions are now moving in, because remember, they're voltage gated, they're activated by a certain voltage, right? And this usually happens when we're at the threshold, right? Negative 55. Well, sorry about that. This should be around negative, yeah, this should be around negative 60, right? Wrote the numbers wrong, my bad, right? So here, negative 55 millivolts, right? So here we start seeing full depolarization, right? So what's happening to the membrane? We have this switching, right? So let's say that outside we have resting potential here, where the message is, right? Let's show this. We're saying that this is inside and these are out, right? Just showing the axon, right? So we're gonna have positive charge on the outside. Remember, this is resting potential. But on where the message is now, active potential or action potential, we're gonna have a switching of charges, where outside becomes more negative and inside becomes more positive as sodium ions start to rush inside the membrane. So it is important to also note that action potential moves like a wave, right? So this general wave, right, will move. So after it crosses a point, then the charges will flip, right? So it's something like that. So action potential acts like a wave. So it's the action potential wave, right? So if you think about a stadium, right? So I don't know, sometimes in stadiums people like to stand and throw up their arms and make the audience wave, right? The parts of the audience when they get up, right, and wave, that could be known as the action potential, right? And then it starts to wave around the stadium. So action potential travels around the stadium. So it's not that there's gonna be more negative charge inside, well, outside, and more positive charge inside across the entire axon, right? But it's at sections and it's going to move across the axon, right? I hope I brought that through clearly. If there are any questions, please put some in the comments, right, to help me help you, right? So we have that there. So the action potential is going to be moving across the axon, right? So as it leaves this place, as it leaves here, right, it's going to go back to resting potential, while here starts to be active. So it starts to move down in phases across the axon. I hope that's a little helpful there. Right? So this is generally depolarization. What happens when we have the threshold reached. Now generally what you'd expect to happen is that charge will actually single out, right? You'd expect charge to actually, you know, completely single out in a way, right, where outside and inside would remain as the same charge, but that is not true, right? That won't actually happen. Sodium ions channels would actually, you know, pump sodium in until there's an overshoot, right? And that's where we're going to get some amount of, hold on, right? I forgot to have a look at the overshoot page. Let's get the overshoot page. Yeah, so we tend to have an overshoot. So we know that our action potential, right, will be around negative 70. But what will happen is that these channels, well, these channels will continue, these sodium voltage gated channels will continue to pump sodium in at an alarming rate. So sodium ions continue to pump in, right? What does this do? This creates our our inner membrane charge, right, to be around positive 30 millivolts. So it jumps, right? So it's overshooting, right? It generally jumps, right? So it generally ends around there for that. It generally ends around here for negative 30. And what we have after that would be repolarization. All right. Now, within repolarization, we'll notice that there's going to be an excess of positively charged ions, right? Getting our entire potential to be around positive 30 millivolts, right? But something starts to happen, right? Something starts to happen around there. This voltage triggers another type of voltage gated ion channel, right? And these activate the ones that are permeable to potassium, right? So these channels open, are open, and potassium ions quickly start to move out to reduce the charge, right? So potassium ions quickly start to move out. So sodium is rushing in, so potassium is now moving out. So you could think of these potassium voltage gated channels, right? So the potassium ones, right, as bouncers at a club or something like that, right? Where they'll try to prevent too much persons from getting in. So they're the guards, right? Trying to stop persons from overflowing, right? The club or the membrane, right? So too much sodium is coming in. So these channels now start to push out potassium, trying to minimize the charge, right, within, right? And this will cause repolarization, right? So what this is aiming to do, right, is to reduce the charge, or reduce charge, right, for us to return to a resting potential. So this is what it's trying to do now. So here we see a loop, right? So we overshoot, and now we're trying to reduce the charge. So we're pushing potassium ions out. We don't want them in here. We're trying to make sure that all the positive charge is building up. We're trying to get it out. So if I could probably try to show that right here, right? So let's say that at this part of the membrane, we notice that there's going to be a lot of positive charge in here. That's not what we want. So the gates will try to push the positive charge out, right? So it's trying to push the positive charges out. So let's say that this is a before. That's before, right? And then we're gonna have after over here. After now, we know is that more positive is gonna be out here, so it's gonna get more negative in here. So that's why we call it repolarization, right? We're getting the active state back to the passive state, right? So we're looking at that. So hopefully that was helpful as well, right? Now we're gonna be decreasing so much, right? We're gonna be moving out so much, right? Remember that the voltage gated potassium channels, right, are gonna be moving them out, right? Now we could say, okay, I forgot to mention something here, right? While potassium is moving out, the sodium ones, hold on. Give me one moment. Right? What we're gonna see here So what we're gonna see here is that the sodium channels that we're pumping sodium in, right? Forgot to state this. These would be closed off, right? At repolarization, right? So those will be closed off, causing the potassium to really make the difference here, right? So that will happen there. So those channels are closed off, allowing potassium to try to regain polarization, all right? Now here at hyperpolarization, now the channels now, the potassium ones, the potassium ion voltage gated channels, right, are now closed too. So they're now closed too, right? So this allows time for the leaky channels to regain at resting potential, right? So we're seeing here that what's happening here, right, is that the charge distribution reduced the potential so much, right, that it went to around negative 80 millivolts, right? Negative 80 millivolts. So we see that there. So it's going to reduce so much until around negative 80 millivolts, right? And now for hyperpolarization now, because it's 80 millivolts, we start to close off these channels. Negative 80 millivolts, we start to close off these channels, right? So these channels start to close off because remember that our resting potential is negative 70, right? And it has reduced too much. So we're gonna end up needing our potassium ion pumps to continue working, right? And our leaky potassium channels to continue working to reestablish the potential, right? So we're gonna go from 80 now, negative 80 millivolts, to around negative 70 or negative 70 millivolts. Right? So hope that was helpful there. So now let me just do a brief recap with a graph. Right? So let's look at a graph of it. We're gonna have our membrane potential. Wait, let me see. All right, so we're gonna have our membrane potential, and then we're gonna have time. All right, so this is per unit time. Let's say that this is time in milliseconds. All right, and then here speaks to our membrane potential in millivolts. All right, so at around 55, so negative 55, right, around negative 55 there, we know this will be our threshold, right? At around positive 30, we know that should be our overshoot area, right? And we know that negative 70 should be resting potential, right? At around negative 80, that would be too much, right? So resting potential, right, it really starts at around 70, and then it goes up. This is around hypopolarization before it reaches full polarization. Then it reaches the threshold for a second, and then we have complete increase. So remember that this increase happens, oh sorry about that. So this increase happens because of the voltage gated potassium, well not potassium yet, but the sodium ones, right? And then it reaches around positive 30. Around there, then they close off and allow voltage gated potassium ion channels to now do their thing, going through repolarization. But it tends to repolarize the membrane a bit too much, so it goes below to around negative 80. And then it returns to around negative 70 resting potential. Alright? So around here is hypopolarization. Around here is depolarization. Right? Here would be the overshoot. Right? Here would be repolarization. Here would be hyperpolarization. Right? Remember, negative 55 is our threshold. So our threshold. Right? So we have that. So within here, we know that it's only the sodium, potassium. Let me not do it like that. Here we know that it is the sodium, potassium channels. Right? At both places here as well. Sodium, potassium channels working. Right? And around the polarization area, we're gonna have voltage gated sodium channels working. Right? So they open. Then here we have voltage gated sodium channels. They close off. And then we have the opening of the voltage gated potassium ion channels. Open. Alright. Then around for hyperpolarization, right, we have the voltage gated potassium ion channels closed. Alright. So this video is a bit tricky to do, but I hope that makes a difference, right? So that would be the entirety of action potential. Right? So if you needed to go over, I recommend you just rewatch the different sections of the video. Right? I went back a few times, right, but that should be fine. So you should be able to get through this. So if there are any questions or concerns, don't be afraid to reach out in the comment section, right? And I'll respond to you and see if I can iron out any issues. And if I do that, I'll probably upload another video, right, ironing out an issue, right? So that is it.